Night drills had settled over the ridge, the way a dull gray draft drapes itself across the sand, pulling thin strings of dust over the stacked weapon crates. The flood towers buzzed out of rhythm, their lights fluttering against the empty stretch of desert. One steel sensor popped softly, its screen flashing red before fading out. The SEALs turned toward it, irritated, assuming it was just another malfunction. It wasn't. A lone round had sliced through a corner plate with impossible precision, threading through drifting smoke and unsettled wind, at a range nobody had accounted for that night. "Who fired that?" Lieutenant Grant Marlowe called out, his voice echoing across the open ground. "That shot wasn't even inside the firing window," no one replied. Boots shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The silence thickened, heavy and unmoving. Behind a stack of crates, Staff Sergeant Tessa Moreland stood motionless, posture straight, her face impossible to read. A thin veil of gray smoke lingered from where a suppressed round had bled into the cold air. She didn't speak. She didn't claim anything. No hint that it had come from her. Before we get rolling, remember to subscribe to Old Bill's Tales so you don't miss these real stories of grit, and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from today. Tessa had shown up just after nightfall, walking by herself along the gravel path leading toward the firing line. No transport dropped her off. No teammate walked beside her, and nobody stepped forward to greet her. She moved quietly under the bright towers, carrying a worn deployment pack that had clearly survived more weather than typical issued gear. The straps were frayed, the corners dulled from dust and rain, and faint salt marks clung to spots where water had dried long ago. Her boots were clean, but the sides showed years of wear, and she walked at an easy pace, as if she neither needed nor expected attention. People noticed regardless. Eyes drifted her way, then slipped off again. And the assumption came quickly. A lone female staff sergeant arriving without escort didn't look like someone brought in to train a SEAL detachment. Most figured she was admin support or maybe public affairs, there to track numbers or take attendance. Someone whispered exactly that, not meaning for it to carry. But sound moves differently when silence owns the ground. She gave no reaction. Her gaze stayed forward, her stance collected, and when she reached the table lined with gear bags, she quietly began setting up her equipment. First, she tightened her gloves, pulling them snug around her wrists. Then she brushed dust from the cloth draped over her scope, folding it neatly before placing it beside her rifle case. She skipped no steps, made no hurried motions. Every piece of her setup was arranged with slow, practiced certainty, like muscle memory carved long ago. Nothing dramatic, just deliberate. Private Owen Brigg approached with the nervous half-confidence of someone still new enough to introduce himself to anyone nearby. He hovered for a second, clearing his throat once, then again. When he finally spoke, she turned slightly. Not startled, not bothered, just acknowledging that he was there. He introduced himself, tripping a little over her rank, his voice shaky but polite. Her reply came soft, steady, almost completely flat in tone. Owen bobbed his head too quickly and retreated, not sure what else to say. Her gentleness only convinced everyone further. Quiet meant unsure, reserved meant inexperienced. Humility meant lack of time in the field. What none of them noticed was how she tracked the angle of the floodlights, without lifting her chin. How she read dust patterns rolling across open ground. How she counted the seconds between wind shifts without jotting anything down. None of that looked like clerical duty. It echoed the instinct of someone who'd learned long ago how the wind sounds just before it turns. She looked surprisingly young for 29. Small frame, narrow shoulders under her jacket, sleeves rolled without a sharp crease, her hair tied back in a simple knot. Nothing in her stance suggested force or the kind of presence shaped directly by combat. Her sleeves carried no special patches beyond standard unit markings, except for one faint emblem tucked beneath the edge of her vest. You wouldn't notice it unless the light hit from the right angle. An old Sierra Recon mark, faded to a ghost. No newcomer walks around with something that worn, unless they earned it the hard way. Her rangefinder didn't match current issue either. The casing was old, scratched up, dulled by years of weather instead of storage. Someone chuckled under their breath, assuming outdated gear meant she wasn't high priority. But scratches like that never come from office work. They come from terrain. Sergeant First Class Reed Callahan saw it as he passed. He didn't greet her, or try to start a conversation. His eyes caught the battered rangefinder for a second, then shifted away. He knew what gear like that meant. Some people are better met with silence than small talk. Whispers drifted from under the briefing canopy. Someone claimed she'd come from a mountain unit, unconfirmed. Another added she'd done winter warfare training at some point. A third voice laughed, saying stories like that pop up every time someone new arrives. Tessa Moreland kept working, unfazed. She wrapped gauze around a cracked stock insert so the recoil wouldn't scrape exposed skin. She tapped windscreen buttons with the back of her glove to keep the surface from catching reflections. Then, she knelt to adjust her tripod legs. Just a tiny correction, but uneven ground can throw off even suppressed shots. To most observers, nothing she did looked unusual. But to anyone who'd ever fired in unstable terrain, those little fixes weren't small at all. They were survival habits. Owen Brigg wandered back, hovering awkwardly as he told her he'd heard she was here to help with scoring. She nodded, letting him keep the assumption. He walked off, looking satisfied. That was her quiet advantage. She never corrected the stories people invented. Underestimation was easier than explanation. The last bit of daylight slipped away, leaving the floodlights to take over. Wind thickened, direction shifting every few breaths. Tessa opened a small notebook. Not a regulation log, but hand-drawn lines mapping bullet drop over incline angles. She didn't write anything new, just skimmed a page and tucked it back. Callahan walked past again, slowing only long enough to notice how her glove rested on the rifle stock. Not gripping, simply settled. Day shooters squeeze hard. Night shooters learn softer habits. As the ridge grew colder, she stepped toward the open sand track. A gust rolled through. She tilted her head slightly, waiting it out. She lifted a pinch of dust, let it fall, watched how it drifted, then gave a small nod. Calibration done. Alone. Unnoticed. Uncelebrated. Others joked, argued, and complained about zeros drifting off center. Tessa stayed quiet, breath steady, her eyes calm behind the thinning smoke. They'd understand later why that mattered, but not tonight. Not yet. Then Lieutenant Grant Marlowe moved to the center of the firing line with the posture of a man accustomed to instant obedience. Training was officially underway, and he wanted a polished demonstration for the SEAL evaluation. He called shooters forward in order of seniority. Tessa's name went last. Bottom slot, he phrased it. We'll give her a turn at the end if there's time. No one argued. No one expected anything. Nobody expected much. The first two shooters misjudged their wind calls completely. A sudden gust swept across the ridge, dragging grit over the kneeling mats. The first SEAL fired too soon, his round drifting left of the center plate. Someone snorted a laugh. Marlowe waved off the mistake with a quick, "Move it, correct and fire again." The second shooter misread the drop and clipped the lower edge, the sensor stuttering for half a second before recovering. Heads shook. Someone let out a sarcastic whistle. When Tessa Moreland stepped up, no one even shifted to give her space. She moved forward on her own, lifted her rifle without leaning on the table, and dropped to a knee, different from the prone position everyone else used. She took a single breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger without the usual stabilization routine. The suppressed shot slipped out low and smooth, barely louder than the wind. The sensor flashed green. No reaction followed. No acknowledgement. Not even a nod. Someone muttered that a lucky gust probably nudged her round. Another guessed it was pure chance. Tessa simply cycled the bolt, lowered her rifle, and stepped back. The next shooter loudly adjusted his elevation, convinced he'd show her up. He fired and missed wide, the dust plume exposing a crosswind shift he hadn't accounted for. Tessa glanced sideways, made a tiny adjustment, so small it looked pointless, and fired again, dead center. This time, silence crept in gradually, like people weren't ready to admit they'd seen it. Someone joked that she must have measured that angle hours earlier. She didn't respond. She didn't recheck tape, notes, or even peek at her rangefinder. She just watched the wind, then fired again. Another perfect hit. Marlowe didn't look impressed. "Anybody can repeat a shot," he said, trying to sound sure of himself. "Real work happens when the wind moves and visibility drops." His tone held doubt more than authority. He paced behind the shooters, then stopped beside Tessa. His voice lowered just enough to be overheard. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, ever deploy with a real field team, or do you just run classroom drills?" She stayed silent. He waited for an excuse, an argument, even a hint of defensiveness. Instead, she reached for her bipod, shifted it slightly, then slipped the elevation sleeve off her optic and set it aside. She was choosing to shoot without markers. That bothered him more than any comeback would have. Owen Brigg, 3 positions down, watched her closely. His ear protection hung loose around his neck. He caught her breathing pattern. Not deep cycles, not measured exhales, just a steady stillness before movement. She didn't breathe when she pressed the trigger. She didn't blink either. His brow tightened as he realized he'd never seen anyone disregard respiratory timing so calmly. The others didn't notice. They were still laughing between their turns, light, confident noise without attention behind it. Marlowe called another shooter up. His round dropped too low. The next missed again. "Offset," someone muttered, but no adjustment seemed to fix anything. Then Tessa stepped into the open for her next shot. She raised her rifle, no hesitation, no looking for approval. The wind shifted sharply this time, a cold burst sweeping through the ridge, tugging at canvas straps. Instead of recalculating, she simply changed the angle of her cheek weld and fired. Direct center hit. The wind had changed. She hadn't. The laughter eased. Not instantly, not dramatically, just fewer voices, shorter breaths. People started watching the ridge instead of each other. Owen took a step closer, eyes locked on her hands. He noticed she never braced for recoil. She didn't tense, didn't flinch. It wasn't strength. It was familiarity, pure and simple. Marlowe stepped toward her again. "So, Staff Sergeant," he said, "word is you came off a deployment cycle, though I haven't seen anything attached to your file. Which mountain unit was it supposed to be? Or is that just another story floating around?" Tessa only tightened her glove a touch. No reply. Marlowe smirked, taking her silence as invention. Someone beside him nodded, already convinced. But Owen Brigg knew silence wasn't surrender. It was control. The wind shifted sharply, cutting across the ridge at a steep angle. The next SEAL in line asked for updated wind numbers. Tessa glanced up, not at him, not at Marlowe, just toward the air, and nudged her bipod leg a half-inch. No rangefinder, no recalculating. Her next round struck dead center. Someone finally whispered, "That's not luck." The casual laughter thinned out. Not gone, but changed. Soldiers recognize when someone isn't shooting on chance. Owen found himself studying her grip again. Then he saw it. She wasn't squeezing the stock at all. She rested into it, letting the recoil fold naturally into her movement. Only people who fired on unstable surfaces learn to do that. And in that moment you might wonder, would you have spoken up or stayed quiet like the rest? Marlowe stepped forward, lifted his hand, and called a halt. "Full smoke." Smoke canisters rolled across the line in clusters. "If she's as accurate as some of you think," he added, "let's see what she does when nobody can see a thing." He assumed she'd fall apart. So did most others. Owen didn't. He just watched her step into the thickening haze, settling into that same steady posture, like it was where she belonged. The ridge went quiet again, not with confidence but with the expectation that she'd finally break. Training wasn't finished, but the noise had already drained away. Smoke crawled over the ridge in heavy columns, sinking low until every target marker blurred into soft silhouettes. The wind shoved the haze one way, then dragged it back, never settling long enough for anyone to find a clean sight picture. It wasn't dramatic, just hard, visibility thinning into shifting patches, outlines dissolving into drifting fog. Off to the right, someone kicked grenade casings out of the lane, the metal rattling across gravel. Target sensors blinked weakly, their lights swallowed by the mist. Marlowe adjusted 2 targets under a low lamp, cutting contrast even more. Even when the smoke thinned, the light bounced poorly off the steel. No one liked this setup. It rewarded people who understood terrain, not manuals. Tessa stepped forward without hesitation. Her rifle settled against her shoulder like muscle memory, not technique. Every shooter ahead of her went prone, flat bodies on cold mats, elbows locked, boots braced in gravel. Tessa didn't copy them. She knelt, one knee planted, the other raised, torso upright instead of parallel to the ground. It looked inefficient, unstable. Someone muttered that kneeling wasn't right for this distance. Someone else called it bad retention form. She let both comments pass. Reed Callahan noticed before anyone else. The posture wasn't improvised. It was geometric, practiced. He'd seen it once during Avalanche Risk live fire, years back. A kneeling shot keeps your body ahead of cold wind and stops recoil from burying the barrel in soft ground. He didn't mention it. He just stared a bit too long before walking away. Owen stayed near her flank, acting like he wasn't watching. He saw her take half a breath. Not full, not deep, just enough to settle. She held it. Her finger drifted onto the trigger but didn't press. She waited for the wind to shift, not for any command. That wasn't classroom timing. That was adaptation learned the hard way. Owen leaned forward for a better angle on her expression. Calm profile, jaw relaxed, eyes steady through drifting sparks of smoke. He tried matching her breathing in secret and found his chest shaking after 2 seconds. Hers didn't shake at all. "That's not standard range technique," someone whispered behind them. It wasn't criticism, more like confusion in disguise. Callahan didn't respond, but the recognition in his posture said everything. Whoever Tessa Moreland had been before this assignment, she wasn't some blank slate. Smoke thickened once more, drifting heavy over the ridge. Her rifle stayed steady. She never adjusted the bipod, never rechecked her optic even though standard procedure demanded it after every shift in visibility. She skipped all of that, not out of ego, but because she didn't need it. She waited, not for clearance or shouted adjustments, but for the wind's rhythm to settle into something she recognized. Owen Brigg narrowed his eyes, peering through a thin gap in the haze. She wasn't aiming where the target had last been. She aimed just above where it would reappear once the fog drifted. That wasn't guessing. That was tracking something she'd already lost, and knowing exactly how it would return. He couldn't explain it, but he knew nobody teaches that in regular schoolhouses. Someone coughed behind them. Boots scraped against gravel. A range light flickered weakly. Tessa leaned forward a fraction, barely a movement at all. But Owen caught her eyes tracing an invisible line in the air, trying to find the point where the wind might split. His shoulders tightened without knowing why. No target confirmation had been called. No fresh wind numbers announced. Marlowe hadn't given a firing sequence. Yet, her posture locked in. A quiet suspicion moved along the firing line. Not spoken aloud, but unmistakable. Tessa wasn't following range protocol. She moved like someone repeating what they'd once lived through, not what they'd been taught. She exhaled half a breath, waiting, not hesitating, just remembering. And that kind of silence settled deeper than any smoke cloud. Marlowe stepped forward, irritation tugging at his jaw. Those earlier hits bothered him more than he'd ever admit, so he decided to strip away all doubt. "Timed engagement," he called out. No one had prepared for that. Heads turned. A few shooters frowned at the sudden rule change. 3 targets, 5 seconds apart. Full smoke. No call-outs. Pure awareness and discipline. Someone muttered that nobody trains for that timing without preset coordinates. Marlowe ignored it. He stepped back, lifted his tablet, and programmed the illumination sequence. "Seal, shooter up first," he ordered. A confident marksman stepped forward, posture strong. Tessa stood behind him, untouched gear in her hands. No rifle adjustments, no scope reset, not even a change in her cheek weld. She just waited. Same knee position, same calm breath. The countdown began. The first target lit through smoky yellow haze. The SEAL fired quickly, hitting somewhere near the center. The sensor flashed, and a few people chuckled. The second target lit. Wind snapped sideways between open pockets and thick fog. His round missed wide, clanging against rock behind the target. The third lit. He overcorrected and hit the plate's edge. The crowd clapped anyway. Someone joked he got greedy. Marlowe accepted the attempt with a short nod. Another shooter took his place. First shot decent. Second shot low. Third too late. 6 seconds, not 5. "We're not here for almost," Marlowe said, shutting it down. The mood shifted. People quieted. Relaxation drained out of the air. Then came Tessa's turn. Staff Sergeant Moreland, last again, placed there deliberately. Marlowe's tone carried the suggestion she didn't even need to participate. She stepped forward regardless and dropped to her familiar kneeling stance. Same posture, same controlled steadiness. Smoke thickened as new canisters filled the ridge. Someone coughed through the fumes. Reed Callahan stood behind her, not close, but watching. Owen drifted nearer too, pulled in without realizing it. Marlowe tapped the screen, initiating the sequence. The first target glowed a dim yellow. She fired instantly, her suppressed shot barely audible, just a soft crack, followed by the plate lighting center hit. The second target glimmered through heavy, drifting vapor. Wind shoved sideways even harder this time. She didn't adjust her optic, she didn't change her height, she didn't blink. Second shot, direct center. The sensor flared green. Voices froze mid-breath. The wind changed again, sharp, sudden, unpredictable. Not gradual at all. A hard, sideways punch. Before anyone had time to register the wind shift, before anyone even thought about recalculating, Tessa Moreland released her third round. She didn't fire into the lit center. She fired straight into darkness, where the smoke hadn't cleared enough for the target frame to show. She shot before the third plate was visible at all. No one understood what she was aiming at. Then, the steel lit up bright dead center. 3 plates, back to back, all inside the time window. No adjustments, no recalibration, no rangefinder, not even a noticeable breath. Someone whispered too loudly, "What was that? That's not—" But the sentence collapsed. There was no cheering, no burst of recognition, just disbelief, the slow kind that grows when the eye can't locate a single mistake to explain it away. The seconds that followed felt stretched thin. Wind gusted again, carrying smoke in lazy drifts. Tessa didn't look at her shots, didn't examine the plates, didn't treat the moment like it meant anything. She stepped back and lowered her rifle as though she'd done something routine. Captain Damon Price, the SEAL officer leading the evaluation, walked forward, uncertainty replacing his usual firm expression. He'd seen solid shooting under ugly wind conditions before, but the timing, the shifts, the lack of recalibration, none of it matched training doctrine. He glanced at Marlowe, then at the plates, then across the firing line. "Who fired those 3?" he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody answered. The silence wasn't shame, it was confusion. Price raised his voice. "Who took that string?" Still, no volunteers. Even the shooter who'd gone before her, the one who missed, just stared blankly, part awe, part silence. He had no joke left, no easy comment. Owen Brigg finally looked toward Tessa, searching her expression. "Staff Sergeant," Price asked. "That your set?" She didn't nod or deny it. Didn't lift her chin. She just stood there, hand resting near the rifle grip, claiming nothing. A fresh breeze slid across the ridge, thinning the smoke just enough to reveal all three plates. Impact marks grouped so tight, they couldn't belong to three separate shooters. Owen stepped forward instinctively, hands tucked behind his vest straps, eyes darting between the plates and her glove. No one understood her timing. No one understood how she fired before illumination. No one understood how she found her marks through fog. She offered no explanation. Someone whispered, "Maybe it's a pre-recorded device. Instructors fake shots sometimes." "That wasn't fake," another replied. Marlowe walked out to inspect the plates himself. Each round had hit center, but not in identical spots. A subtle diagonal pattern rising across the steel. She'd compensated not only distance but lateral drift as the wind built through the sequence. That wasn't basic marksmanship. That was dynamic correction in motion. He turned toward her. His voice was controlled, neither praise nor dismissal. "Where'd you learn that?" She dusted her scope cloth, folded it, slipped it back into its pouch and kept her eyes down. That was her answer. Not pride, not secrecy, just refusal to decorate the truth. Price lowered his tablet. "Run it again," he said quietly. Someone protested. "Same smoke, same spacing. Nobody hits three under shifting wind twice. That's just luck." Price didn't blink. "Run it again." Smoke was deployed anew, rolling thick over the ridge in gray and green layers until visibility shrank below rifle length. Sensors blinked weakly. Ridge lights hummed overhead. This time, Tessa stepped forward before anyone said her name. She didn't wait for instruction or order. She knelt, brought the rifle to her shoulder, and settled in. No words, no attention-seeking, just readiness. The sequence began. Target 1 lit. She fired instantly, center. Target 2 flickered through haze. She fired a half-second early, center. Target 3 glowed faintly. She fired a full second early, before the plate fully emerged, and the sensor lit green. Owen whispered, "No way," not realizing it carried. No clapping, no teasing, no applause, no space for humor. Not after watching something that didn't resemble standard infantry training or sniper school habit. Smoke drifted aside little by little. Her silhouette appeared first, then her rifle, then her kneeling form. She didn't adjust straps or pat the trigger guard or switch to standing. She rose calmly, gathered her gear, and stepped aside. Everything in the way Tessa Moreland moved made it clear she'd done all of this before, under worse skies, in places where no one had been around to witness it. She walked back into the haze quietly, unclaimed, unrevealed. This wasn't her moment of exposure, just the shift. The point where disbelief stopped being noise and started becoming curiosity. Chief Warrant Officer Cole Rennick arrived without announcement, coming down the path that cut behind the firing line. He wasn't part of the night's rotation. He was only there to retrieve documents from a field case assigned to the SEAL detachment. A simple handoff, nothing more on paper. He stepped from the canopy's glow into thinning smoke, a black case tucked under his arm, eyes scanning equipment tags out of habit. Then he froze, not because of paperwork, but because Tessa, still kneeling, had settled into that same posture again while packing gear into her deployment bag. Smoke drifted in thin strands across her outline, folding around her shape. Rennick stopped mid-step, boots half buried in gravel. "You still shoot kneeling," he said softly. Not loud enough to sound like instruction, not quiet enough to pass as a stray thought. "Just like you did on Vesper Ridge." The words hung there, not aimed at her, not aimed at anyone in particular. Yet everyone heard them. Heads turned. Marlowe, lifted his eyes first, not defensive, but searching for what he'd missed. Reed Callahan stiffened, pieces finally clicking into place. Owen Briggs stared straight at Rennick, mouth parted slightly, not grasping the history, but sensing the weight of it. No one moved. No one breathed deep. Tessa paused, one strap of her bag still hanging from the table's edge. She didn't flinch or turn. She simply lowered the strap gently to the fabric. Rennick stepped forward slowly, as if walking towards something remembered rather than someone present. He wasn't seeking confirmation. He already had it. He stopped near her, not directly in front, just close enough that dust settled in the narrow space between them. "You held the line through night 37, he said, voice steady but thin. "Wind shear every 8 minutes. Visibility 0. Remember?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Silence was her answer. Captain Damon Price moved beside Marlowe, confusion tightening his brow as his tone shifted from authority to disbelief. "Wait, that was you." The question barely left his mouth. Everyone already knew. Rennick adjusted his stance, not stiff, not ceremonial, simply human, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. He wasn't saluting rank. He wasn't saluting performance. He was saluting endurance, an echo of a ridge where people clung to ground no one thought they could hold, waiting for help that almost didn't come. Tessa didn't return the salute. She didn't have to. Recognition was complete without the gesture. Someone in the crowd stepped back. Someone lowered their rifle. Another loosened fingers they didn't realize they'd been clenching. Silence didn't drop all at once. It thickened and settled, heavier than the smoke ever had. Because now every shot she'd taken, every kneeling stance, every impossible correction, none of it came from theory or manuals. It came from memory, from history. Rennick lowered his hand and let out a long exhale, as if releasing something that had weighed on him for years. He said nothing else. Neither did she. Some truths don't need storytelling. They live fine inside silence. Rennick didn't offer details. He didn't recount events or paint dramatic scenes. He spoke like someone recalling a place still frozen in the back of his mind. "She held the line through night 37, he murmured again. "Visibility 0. Wind shear every 8 minutes. No rotation. She never stepped off that scope until the extraction corridor opened." He didn't name survivors, didn't mention injuries, didn't say how many rounds were fired or how long they waited. He simply put truth into the quiet, just enough for it to settle. And that was all it needed. People slowly began to understand that what they'd witnessed hours earlier wasn't a display, wasn't a show, and certainly wasn't luck. It was muscle memory carved from nights long enough to strip away ego and leave only endurance. The same shots cutting through tonight's smoke had once pushed through weather most would never willingly enter. Someone along the left firing mat lowered his rifle, avoiding eye contact. Another glanced at her old weapon case, the one that lacked the shine of new inventory, and nodded quietly. Marlowe stepped forward, his posture no longer carrying command or reprimand, only level understanding. "You trained up north, didn't you?" he asked, softer than before. Tessa Moreland didn't answer. He didn't press. Something in his tone shifted. Not apology, not concession, just recognition that some people earn their story long before any briefing room decides who they are. Captain Damon Price approached next. Not assertive, not demanding. He held an empty range notebook loosely in one hand. "Would you demonstrate that wind call method?" he asked. No authority now. Just a request. Tessa shook her head, polite but firm. "It won't translate here," she said. Price stepped back, respecting the line. Owen Briggs stood close by, unsure whether he should speak, unsure whether he even belonged near her after what had just come to light. His boots hesitated, toe grinding gently into the gravel. Tessa approached him anyway. Not dramatically, just naturally. She didn't say anything at first. She guided his elbow down a fraction with 2 fingers, adjusted his supporting hand forward, then lowered his upper shoulder slightly. He straightened, without realizing why. "You breathe more than you aim," she said. "Reverse that. No performance. No audience. Just the truth." Owen swallowed. "Okay," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of a moment larger than his vocabulary. Cole Rennick was the first to turn away, file case tucked under his arm. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Marlowe lingered a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not toward her or Price, but toward the reality of what he'd seen. Several SEALs stepped aside instinctively, clearing a path for her. No formation, no instruction. They just moved, because some people carry their own corridor with them. Tessa packed her gear with unceremonious precision. No rush. No hint that she wanted acknowledgement for anything that happened that night. A low sweep of wind pushed dust around scattered casings. Floodlights hummed overhead, colder now than at the start of training. She lifted her rifle case by its worn handle, the old scratched marking catching a faint gleam. Owen watched it, as though trying to memorize a shape he didn't yet understand, but sensed he someday would. Nobody saluted her. Nobody clapped. And that felt right. Respect doesn't show up through applause. It shows through quiet shifts in posture, lowered voices, stopped interruptions. She walked off the range without spotlight or call sign, leaving only the weight of a moment settling behind her, like still air. Sometimes the most honest climax isn't celebration, it's silence. And silence stretched farther than the ridge itself. Training ended without ceremony. No announcement, no final briefing, no after-action rundown. People simply gathered their gear, slid bolts into cases, folded mats, and cleared brass from the gravel. Voices stayed low, not because anyone ordered quiet, but because noise no longer felt appropriate. The floodlights dimmed as the generators eased down, and loose paper targets drifted across the ground in the wind. Owen Brigg lingered near the empty firing lane, repeating her words under his breath without realizing it. "You breathe more than you aim. Reverse that." He whispered it again, trying to feel the rhythm of breath before settling his shoulder the way she'd adjusted it. He wasn't chasing her approval. He was chasing a kind of precision no manual had ever managed to teach him. Grant Marlowe passed across her path on his way to the gear racks. He didn't offer a speech, apology, or praise. He simply paused long enough to look in her direction, giving a small nod. Not approval, not surrender, just a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he'd missed earlier. Tessa Moreland returned it only with steady eye contact, before continuing to stack her gear. She didn't stay for conversation, didn't wait for admiration. She lifted her pack strap over her shoulder, dust clinging lightly to the fabric. No one walked with her. No one followed. She moved across the gravel toward the dim exit path, her footsteps fading before anyone found their voice again. Owen stood a little taller after she left. Training hadn't changed, only how he saw it. Captain Damon Price closed his notebook without writing a word. Nothing he could put on paper would capture what mattered. Some reflections don't arrive loudly. They show themselves in a quiet moment. Some legends never introduce themselves. Their presence handles that part. Tessa never raised her voice, never explained her past, never framed her actions. Yet, the lesson stayed. Plain, unembellished, unforgettable. And the ridge held its silence long enough for everyone to understand what they'd witnessed. Not performance, not competition, not display. Just someone who stayed precise when conditions tried to tear alignment apart. Honor doesn't shout. It stays steady when everything else wavers. There are stories that never make headlines. Stories carried by people who never ask for attention. Tonight was one of those stories. If moments like this resonate with you, be sure to subscribe to Old Bill's Tales so you never miss these quiet truths of courage. Drop a comment with where you're listening from, Whether it's a small town, a base overseas, or someplace far across the map, because someone out there needs a reminder that quiet strength still exists. And sometimes, the most extraordinary moments happen in silence.